The lecture hall stretched out like a metallic amphitheater, its crystalline walls pulsing with soft bioluminescent patterns that shifted according to the emotional state of its occupants. Today, those patterns flickered with smugness and intellectual superiority, mirroring the mood of Professor HFY as he stood behind his floating podium. HFY was a magnificent specimen of his species, the Velethians. His 6 arms moved with practiced elegance as he gestured toward the holographic displays that materialized around him. Each arm ended in delicate, 3-fingered hands that could manipulate matter at the molecular level. His elongated cranium, easily twice the size of any human head, housed a brain capable of processing quantum calculations that would make the most advanced Earth computers weep with inadequacy. The professor's skin shimmered with a faint silver hue, and his 4 eyes could perceive electromagnetic spectrums that most species couldn't even imagine. He was 847 years old, which was barely middle-aged for a Velethian, and had spent the last 6 centuries studying what the Galactic Academic Council called primitive species integration theory. In simpler terms, he was an expert on how to handle the stupid aliens. Today's lecture focused on the newest addition to the galactic community, humanity. The species had only been discovered 18 months ago, when one of their primitive chemical rockets had somehow managed to stumble beyond their solar system's edge. The discovery had caused quite a stir among the academic elite, not because humans showed promise, but because they were so remarkably unremarkable. "Observe, students," HFY announced, his voice carrying the melodic tones that made Velethian speech so pleasant to most species. "The human specimen before us represents perhaps the most average intelligence we have ever encountered in our galactic surveys." Scattered throughout the lecture hall sat members of dozens of different species. There were the crystalline Zothmari, whose bodies chimed softly when they moved. The gaseous Neftari floated in specially designed atmospheric suits. Several Thorakian students, each standing 9 feet tall with skin like polished stone, took notes on tablets that would have been considered impossibly advanced by human standards just 2 years ago. At the very back of the hall, in a seat that seemed almost forgotten, sat the subject of today's discussion. The human appeared to be male, though determining gender among such a primitive species was often challenging from physical appearance alone. He was of average height for his kind, perhaps 5 feet 10 inches. His hair was brown, his eyes were brown, and his skin had the pale complexion common to humans from the northern regions of their homeworld's major continents. What struck most observers as remarkable was not anything about his appearance, but his complete and utter silence. Since arriving at the Galactic Academy 3 weeks ago, the human had not spoken a single word. He attended lectures, took notes with a primitive graphite stick on actual paper, and completed assignments when required. But he never asked questions, never participated in discussions, and never showed any emotional reaction to anything around him. The other students had initially tried to engage with him. The Thorakians, being naturally social despite their intimidating appearance, had made several attempts at friendship. The Xothmari had offered to share their crystalline learning matrices. Even the notoriously aloof Neftari had attempted communication through chemical releases that served as their species' equivalent of friendly conversation. The human acknowledged these overtures with polite nods, but never responded verbally. After the first week, most students had given up and assumed he was either mentally deficient or suffering from some sort of trauma related to his species' recent contact with galactic civilization. Professor HFY, however, had developed a different theory. "Notice how the creature simply sits and stares," the professor continued, gesturing toward the human with one of his upper arms. "This is typical behavior for a species that has not yet developed true sentience. What we observe is not intelligence, but rather an elaborate form of mimicry." A Xothmari student chimed a question. "But professor, didn't the human complete the quantum mathematics assignment last week?" The calculations were quite complex. HFY's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a gesture that indicated mild amusement among his kind. "An excellent observation." Student Kothes: "Yes, the creature did complete the assignment, but observe the method." A holographic display materialized, showing the human's submitted work. The equations were correct, but they were solved using what appeared to be an incredibly primitive mathematical approach. Instead of utilizing the elegant quantum shortcuts that any civilized species would employ, The human had solved each problem through brute force calculation. You see, Zethkari explained, this is similar to how certain insects can navigate complex mazes. The behavior appears intelligent to primitive observers, but it is actually just pattern recognition and repetition. The creature has memorized enough mathematical operations to stumble toward correct answers, but it shows no understanding of the underlying principles. Several students made sounds of understanding. The comparison to insects was particularly apt, as most galactic species had encountered insect-level intelligence on their homeworlds and understood the phenomenon of complex behavior arising from simple neural patterns. In the back of the hall, the human continued taking notes. His handwriting was neat and methodical, covering page after page of his primitive paper notebook. He showed no reaction to being discussed as though he weren't present, which Professor Zethkari took as further evidence of his limited cognitive capacity. The truly fascinating aspect, the professor continued, warming to his topic, is how this mimicry has allowed humanity to achieve rudimentary space travel. They have essentially stumbled into technologies they cannot truly comprehend, much like a clever primate might accidentally trigger a food dispenser. This generated actual laughter from some students. The Thorakians' laughter sounded like rocks tumbling down a mountain, while the Neftari's atmospheric suits released small puffs of gas that served the same function. But surely, chimed another Zothmari, the humans must have some redeeming characteristics? The Galactic Council would not have granted them provisional membership status if they showed no potential. Professor Zethkari's skin color shifted slightly toward orange, indicating disdain. The Council's decision was based on political considerations, not academic merit. There are certain factions within galactic government who believe that every species deserves an opportunity to prove themselves, regardless of obvious intellectual limitations. He gestured again toward the human, who was now on his fourth page of notes despite the fact that most other students were using holographic recording devices that captured entire lectures in perfect detail. Consider the inefficiency of its note-taking method, Zethkari observed. Any civilized species would simply download the lecture directly into memory storage. This creature insists on using a chemical marker to make crude symbols on processed plant matter. It is exactly the sort of behavior we would expect from a species that never evolved beyond its primitive origins. The human's pen paused for just a moment, but then resumed its steady movement across the paper. Professor, a Thorakian student rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. What about the reports that humans have demonstrated unusual problem-solving abilities in certain crisis situations? The preliminary integration reports mentioned something about adaptability under pressure. Zethkari's four eyes all focused on the Thorakian student, and his skin color shifted to a deeper orange. Student Morthok, you are referring to unsubstantiated claims made by field observers with limited academic credentials. The so-called adaptability you mention is more likely a panic response that occasionally produces positive outcomes through random chance. He manipulated his holographic display to show a series of charts and graphs. I have conducted extensive analysis of human behavior patterns based on their historical records, which they were naive enough to share freely during first contact. Their entire civilization is built upon crude trial and error learning, rather than logical deduction. The data flowing across the display seemed to support his arguments. Human technological development had indeed been erratic, with long periods of stagnation followed by sudden bursts of advancement. Their scientific method, while producing results, appeared primitive compared to the elegant logical frameworks employed by more advanced species. Furthermore, Zethkari continued, observe how this specimen has been placed in our most basic integration course, yet still struggles with concepts that any juvenile from a properly evolved species would grasp immediately. This was technically true. The human was enrolled in fundamental galactic concepts, which was typically reserved for species making their first contact with galactic civilization. Most species graduated from this course within days and moved on to more advanced studies. The human had been attending for 3 weeks and showed no signs of requesting advancement. The creature's silence itself is highly revealing, the professor added. Higher intelligence naturally seeks to communicate, to share ideas, and engage in intellectual discourse. This specimen's refusal to participate in classroom discussion indicates either severe social dysfunction or, more likely, an awareness of its own intellectual inadequacy. Several students turned to look at the human, who continued writing in his notebook as though completely unaware of their attention. His expression remained neutral, showing neither understanding nor confusion, neither interest nor boredom. "I have developed a hypothesis," Professor Zethkari announced, his skin color shifting to a brilliant gold that indicated excitement and scientific fervor. "I believe that this human's apparent comprehension is entirely illusory. It has learned to mimic the behaviors of intelligence without possessing true understanding." He manipulated his controls, and the holographic display began showing complex mathematical equations and logical frameworks. "Tomorrow, we will conduct a practical demonstration. I will present this specimen with a problem that requires genuine creative thinking rather than mere pattern recognition. We will observe how quickly the facade of intelligence crumbles when faced with a challenge that cannot be solved through memorized responses." The announcement generated considerable interest among the students. Most had never witnessed a formal intelligence evaluation of a primitive species, and the academic value of such a demonstration was significant. "What sort of problem will you present, Professor?" asked Kothes, the Xothmari student who had spoken earlier. Zethkari's golden skin color deepened with satisfaction. "I will use the classical Zev-Thani paradox, modified for this species' limited mathematical background. It is a problem that requires intuitive leaps and creative reasoning that no amount of rote memorization can provide. The creature will be forced to demonstrate whether it possesses actual intelligence or is merely an elaborate biological automaton." The classical Zev-Thani paradox was well known among galactic academics. It involved a seemingly simple question about resource distribution that actually required understanding concepts of infinity, recursive logic, and dimensional mathematics. The elegant solution required not just mathematical ability, but genuine insight into the nature of existence itself. "Will this not be rather cruel to the human?" asked Morthok, the Thrakian student. Despite their intimidating appearance, Thrakians were known for their empathetic nature. "Science requires objectivity," Professor Zethkari replied, though his tone suggested he was looking forward to the demonstration for reasons beyond pure academic interest. "If this species is to be integrated into galactic civilization, we must understand their true capabilities. False kindness that overlooks genuine limitations serves no one." He gestured toward the human again, who was now on his 6th page of notes. "Besides, observe how the creature shows no emotional response to our discussion. This itself demonstrates the limited emotional range typical of lower intelligence species. It simply does not possess the cognitive capacity to understand that it is being discussed." As if to emphasize this point, Zethkari raised his voice slightly. "The human specimen appears to lack even basic self-awareness. It continues its mechanical note-taking behavior regardless of external stimuli." The human's pen continued moving across the paper in steady, measured strokes. "Tomorrow's demonstration will be most illuminating," the professor concluded. "You will observe how a primitive species responds when confronted with its own intellectual limitations. This will provide valuable insights into the integration challenges we face with newly contacted civilizations." Several students were already making arrangements to attend the special demonstration. Word would certainly spread throughout the academy, and Professor Zethkari expected a significant audience for what he anticipated would be a rather one-sided intellectual contest. As the lecture period ended, students began filing out of the hall, chattering among themselves in dozens of different languages and communication methods. The Xothmari chimed melodious discussions about integration theory. The Neftari released complex chemical conversations that created brief, colorful clouds around their atmospheric suits. The Thrakians rumbled about the ethics of intellectual evaluation. Professor Zethkari remained at his podium, organizing his materials and planning the next day's demonstration. He was so absorbed in his preparations that he almost missed the moment when the human finally stood and began gathering his primitive belongings. The creature moved with unremarkable efficiency, placing his pencil and notebook into a simple cloth carrying case. He stood for a moment, seeming to look around the now empty lecture hall, and then began walking toward the exit. As he passed the professor's podium, the human paused. For the first time since arriving at the academy, He looked directly at Professor HFY with those brown eyes that seemed so primitive compared to the professor's sophisticated visual organs. For just a moment, HFY thought he saw something in those eyes. Not intelligence, certainly. His theories about human limitations were too well-founded to be shaken by mere eye contact. But perhaps a flicker of something. Awareness, maybe, or possibly just the kind of cunning that some lower animals displayed when they sensed they were being observed. Then, the moment passed. The human nodded politely, exactly as he had done every day for the past 3 weeks, and continued walking toward the exit. Professor HFY returned to his preparations, already envisioning how he would present his findings about human intelligence to the broader academic community. Tomorrow's demonstration would provide the conclusive evidence needed to support his theories about primitive species and their limitations. He had no way of knowing that in the human's notebook, written in neat handwriting across dozens of pages, was not just a transcription of the day's lecture, but a comprehensive analysis of Valethian psychology, detailed observations about the social dynamics of galactic civilization, and a complete solution to the classical HFY paradox that included 3 alternative approaches the original creators had never considered. The human had been silent not because he couldn't speak, but because he had been listening, and learning, and planning. Tomorrow would indeed be illuminating, but not at all in the way Professor HFY expected. The demonstration hall was packed beyond its normal capacity. Word of Professor HFY's planned intelligence evaluation had spread throughout the Galactic Academy with the speed that only academic gossip could achieve. Students from advanced courses had rearranged their schedules to attend, and several faculty members had positioned themselves in the observation galleries. The hall itself was larger than the standard lecture room, designed for practical demonstrations that required space and specialized equipment. Holographic projectors lined the walls, capable of creating 3-dimensional mathematical models that could be manipulated by thought alone. The air hummed with anticipation, and the subtle energy fields generated by various species' technological implants. Professor HFY stood at the center of the hall, his silver skin gleaming with satisfaction. He had spent the evening refining his presentation, ensuring that the classical HFY paradox would be presented in a way that any sentient being could understand, while remaining impossible to solve without genuine creative intelligence. The human sat in a simple chair facing the professor. Unlike the elaborate support systems used by other species, the Neftari's atmospheric suits, the aquatic Melkari's pressure tanks, the crystalline Zothmari's resonance platforms, ABL, the human required nothing more than a basic seat. This simplicity was taken by most observers as further evidence of the species' primitive nature. Honored colleagues and students, Professor HFY began, his melodious voice easily carrying throughout the hall. Today we witness a practical application of integration assessment theory. Before us sits a representative of humanity, a species that has recently achieved basic space travel through methods we might generously call accidental advancement. Polite laughter rippled through the audience. The human showed no reaction. The individual has attended 3 weeks of fundamental classes without speaking a single word. This behavior pattern, which some might interpret as studious contemplation, is more likely indicative of cognitive limitations that prevent meaningful participation in academic discourse. More murmurs of agreement from the assembled academics. Several were taking detailed notes, as this demonstration would undoubtedly be referenced in future papers about primitive species integration. Today, we will present this specimen with the classical HFY paradox, adapted for its species' mathematical background. This problem has been used for over 2 millennia to evaluate genuine intelligence versus mere computational ability. The solution requires intuitive understanding that cannot be achieved through memorization or pattern recognition. The professor manipulated his controls, and a holographic display materialized between him and the human. The display showed what appeared to be a simple mathematical setup. A series of containers of varying sizes, each containing different amounts of a substance represented by glowing spheres. The problem is straightforward in its presentation. HFY explained to the audience, though he directed his words toward the human. You have 7 containers. Each contains a certain number of units of a vital resource. You must distribute these resources among an unlimited number of recipients, such that each recipient receives exactly what they need. no more and no less. However, the needs of each recipient are determined by how many other recipients exist. Creating a dependency loop, the holographic display shifted, showing mathematical equations that describe the relationship between recipients and their resource requirements. To most species, the problem appeared solvable through standard mathematical approaches. However, the true challenge lay in recognizing that the problem, as stated, was actually impossible to solve using conventional logic. The elegant solution required understanding that the question itself contained false premises, and that the real answer involved rejecting the framework entirely in favor of a higher dimensional approach. It was a test of wisdom rather than mere intelligence. You may use any method you prefer to work toward a solution, the professor continued. The Academy's computers are at your disposal, as are any reference materials you might require. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, the human spoke. I don't need computers or references. His voice was calm, unremarkable in tone, but the simple fact that he had finally spoken caused a stir throughout the hall. May I ask a question? Professor Zethkari's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, but he maintained his composure. Certainly. What is your question? Are the containers made of matter that exists in standard 3-dimensional space? The question was so unexpected that Zethkari paused before answering. That is an unusual inquiry. Yes. For the purposes of this problem, assume standard spatial dimensions. And the recipients, are they also constrained to 3-dimensional existence? Yes. That is the standard assumption. The human nodded and stood up from his chair. Then, the problem as stated, is unsolvable using the given parameters. The dependency loop creates a logical paradox that cannot be resolved within the framework of the question. A hush fell over the hall. Several faculty members leaned forward in their seats. However, the human continued. If we accept that the real test is recognizing the paradox rather than solving the impossible equation, then the answer becomes clear. The true solution requires abandoning the assumption that all elements of the problem exist in the same dimensional framework. Professor Zethkari's skin color began shifting toward orange. That is an interesting interpretation. However, you have not provided an actual solution, haven't I? The human walked toward the holographic display. The solution is to recognize that a truly unlimited number of recipients cannot exist in finite space, and that resources cannot be simultaneously finite in quantity, yet infinite in distribution capacity. The problem tests whether the solver will waste time attempting impossible calculations or recognize that wisdom sometimes means rejecting false premises. The human gestured toward the display with remarkable confidence for a supposedly primitive being. If you insist on a mathematical solution, then we must acknowledge that the containers exist in 3-dimensional space, but the distribution occurs across a 4-dimensional matrix, where temporal recursion allows resource multiplication through quantum coherence. Cascades. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Several students made sounds of confusion, while faculty members began frantically accessing their knowledge databases. Professor Zethkari's skin color was now definitely orange, edging toward red. You speak of concepts that require advanced training in dimensional mathematics. How does a primitive species possess knowledge of quantum coherence cascades? For the first time, the human smiled. It was a small expression, barely noticeable, but somehow it transformed his entire appearance from unremarkable to unsettling. Who told you we were primitive? The simple question reverberated through the hall like a shockwave. Several students made alarmed noises. A few faculty members stood up from their seats. Your species has only recently achieved basic space travel, Professor Zethkari replied, but there was a new uncertainty in his voice. Your technology is crude. Your mathematical approaches are inefficient. And your social structures are chaotic. Our technology appears crude because we designed it that way, the human said calmly. When you're visiting neighbors for the first time, you don't arrive in your most advanced spacecraft. You come in something that won't frighten them or reveal capabilities they're not ready to understand. The human walked closer to the holographic display and made a gesture. Somehow, without any visible interface or control mechanism, the display responded to his movement. The equations began reorganizing themselves into patterns that none of the assembled academics had ever seen before. Our mathematical approaches seem inefficient, because efficiency isn't always the goal. Sometimes the path matters more than the destination. When you're learning about a new civilization, you use their methods to understand how they think. The mathematical patterns in the holographic display were now moving in ways that violated several fundamental principles of information theory. Some faculty members were frantically taking readings with their instruments, getting results that made no sense. As for chaotic social structures, the human continued. Chaos is only a problem if you can't see the underlying pattern. What you call chaos, we call dynamic equilibrium. What you call primitive, we call robust. Professor Zethkari's skin was now deep red, and his 6 arms were moving erratically. This is impossible. We have studied your species extensively. Your historical records show clear evidence of technological primitivism. You studied the records we chose to share. The human said gently. Did you really think a species capable of interstellar travel would give complete historical data to strangers on first contact? The implications of this statement began cascading through the minds of everyone present. If humanity had deliberately misrepresented their capabilities, then every assumption about their integration into galactic civilization was wrong. But your behavior, Professor Zethkari sputtered. You sat silently for weeks. You took notes with primitive writing implements. You showed no evidence of advanced intelligence. I was observing. Learning about galactic academic culture, social hierarchies, and individual psychology profiles. As for primitive writing implements, the human reached into his pocket and pulled out his simple wooden pencil. This represents a perfect understanding of applied chemistry, sustainable resource harvesting, and ergonomic design. It's also completely recyclable, requires no power source, and functions in virtually any environment. Your holographic systems are impressive, but they depend on infrastructure that could fail. This will work in vacuum, underwater, or during an electromagnetic pulse. The professor was beginning to understand that something had gone very, very wrong with his demonstration. The note-taking served multiple purposes, the human continued. It allowed me to practice your languages while appearing harmless. It gave me detailed recordings of every lecture without using any technology that might be detected or monitored. And it provided excellent psychological profiles of every person who assumed that handwriting meant stupidity. Several students were now openly staring at the human, trying to reassess everything they thought they knew. Professor Zethkari, the human said, addressing him directly. You've spent considerable time analyzing what you believe to be human inadequacy. But consider this. If we were truly primitive, how would we have found your civilization at all? The question hung in the air unanswered. Space is large, incomprehensibly large. The odds of a primitive species accidentally stumbling across another civilization are essentially zero. For us to accidentally encounter your scout ships would require either incredible luck or very sophisticated detection capabilities that we deployed from much farther away than you realize. Professor Zethkari's 4 eyes were blinking rapidly now. You're suggesting that your species has had knowledge of our existence for how long? Long enough to prepare adequately for contact. Long enough to study your languages, your social structures, and your individual psychology patterns. Long enough to decide whether you represented a threat or an opportunity. The human gestured again, and the holographic display shifted to show star charts that several faculty members recognized as accurate representations of local galactic geography. But the charts showed details that weren't supposed to be available to newly contacted species, trade routes, military installations, and political boundaries that were considered classified information. The real question, the human said, is not whether we're intelligent enough to integrate into your civilization. The question is whether your civilization is ready to integrate with us. I have agreed stakes. End quote. Professor Zethkari's skin color was now cycling through several shades of distress. But if you possess such advanced capabilities, why maintain the pretense? Why allow yourselves to be treated as And, as primitive specimens for academic study? The human smile had no warmth in it now, perhaps because we needed to understand how you treat species you consider inferior. Character is revealed not in how you treat equals, but in how you treat those you believe beneath you. The silence in the hall was now complete. Even the usually chattering Xoth Mari had stopped chiming. You see, Professor, we've been conducting our own study. While you were examining what you believed to be human intelligence, we were examining galactic ethics. While you were testing our problem-solving abilities, we were testing your moral reasoning. While you were evaluating our worthiness for integration, we were evaluating yours. The human turned to address the entire hall. Some of you have treated the supposedly primitive human with kindness and respect. Others have seen an opportunity to demonstrate your superiority over an apparently lesser being. This information has been carefully recorded. Professor Zethkari suddenly understood the true scope of what had been happening. You've been evaluating us? Comprehensive psychological and social assessment, the human confirmed. 3 weeks of detailed observation under controlled conditions, very illuminating. The professor's 6 arms were now trembling slightly. But surely you must understand that intellectual evaluation is a necessary part of academic, is it? The human interrupted. Because, from where I sit, it looked much more like intellectual bullying. You didn't design a test to understand human capabilities. You designed a public spectacle to humiliate what you believed to be a helpless primitive. The holographic display now showed recordings, audio and visual captures of every interaction the human had experienced at the academy. The professor's lectures took on a very different character when viewed with the knowledge that the human had understood every word. The fascinating thing, the human continued, is that you were so convinced of your own superiority that you never questioned your assumptions. It never occurred to you that a truly advanced species might have reasons for appearing primitive, or that intelligence might sometimes choose silence over speech. Professor Zethkari was beginning to realize that his career, his reputation, and quite possibly his future, were all in serious jeopardy. Please, you must understand. I meant no actual harm. Academic inquiry requires intellectual humility, the human said firmly. It requires recognizing the limits of your own knowledge. It requires treating all subjects of study with dignity and respect. You have demonstrated none of these qualities. The human walked back toward his chair, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he turned to face the assembled students and faculty. I want to be clear about something. Humanity doesn't consider itself superior to any species here. We consider ourselves different. We have capabilities you lack. Just as you have capabilities we lack. True intelligence recognizes that diversity of thought and approach makes everyone stronger. Some students nodded in agreement, while others still seemed to be processing the complete reversal of their understanding. However, the human continued, we cannot allow ourselves to be integrated into a civilization where some members believe that intellectual superiority grants them the right to humiliate others. If we are to join the galactic community, it must be as equals, with mutual respect and understanding. Professor Zethkari suddenly realized where this was heading. What are you saying? I'm saying that humanity's integration into galactic civilization may depend on how this situation is resolved. We will be watching very carefully to see how your academic community responds to the revelation that you have spent weeks publicly humiliating a member of a species that could, if we chose, render your entire civilization obsolete. The words were spoken calmly, without threat or anger, but their implications were terrifying. Several faculty members were already accessing emergency communication channels, undoubtedly trying to contact higher authorities. You see, Professor Zethkari, tomorrow you're going to have a choice to make. And that choice will determine not just your own future, but the future relationship between our species. The human began walking toward the exit, leaving behind a hall full of stunned academics who were just beginning to understand that their entire framework for understanding intelligence, civilization, and superiority had just collapsed around them. I'll give you tonight to think about it, the human said as he reached the door. Tomorrow, we'll see what you've learned. Professor Zethkari had not slept. His species typically required only 4 hours of rest per day cycle. But as dawn broke over the Academy's crystalline spires, he had not managed even a minute of peace. His 6 arms moved restlessly as he paced back and forth across his private office, his silver skin cycling through shades of distress that would have been alarming to any observer. The events of the previous day played and replayed in his mind with excruciating clarity. Every moment of smugness, every condescending gesture, every casual insult directed toward the human, now felt like evidence in a trial where he was both defendant and prosecutor. The worst part was that he could not shake the feeling that this trial had been going on for weeks, and he had been providing evidence for his own conviction without realizing it. His office door chimed softly, indicating a visitor. "Enter," he called, though his voice lacked its usual melodious confidence. To his surprise, it was not a colleague or administrator, but Kothis, the young Xothmari student who had asked thoughtful questions during his lectures. The crystalline being's body was humming at a frequency that indicated serious concern. "Professor," Kothis chimed, "I hope you will forgive the early intrusion. I wanted to speak with you before the formal inquiry begins." "Formal inquiry?" Zethkari's skin color shifted toward deep orange. "The Academy Council has called an emergency session for this morning. Word of yesterday's demonstration has reached the Galactic Integration Committee. They are displeased." The professor felt something that his species rarely experienced: genuine fear. The Galactic Integration Committee had the authority to censure entire academic institutions. If they determined that the Academy had mishandled humanity's integration process, the consequences would extend far beyond his personal career. "Kothis," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "what do you know about the human's true capabilities?" The young Xothmari's crystalline structure shifted colors as she processed the question. "I have been accessing the Academy's quantum databases since yesterday evening, Professor. The information I have found is concerning." She gestured with one of her crystalline appendages, and a small holographic display materialized between them. It showed data streams that made Zethkari's 4 eyes widen in alarm. The human's pencil was apparently composed of materials that do not exist on their homeworld. The graphite contains quantum-stabilized carbon lattices that can only be created using technology we do not possess. His notebook paper includes fibers that serve as biological quantum computers. Every word he wrote was being simultaneously transmitted to receivers we cannot even detect. The professor's skin color was now cycling rapidly through the spectrum. Transmitted where? Unknown. But Professor, that is not the most troubling discovery. Kothis manipulated the display, and new data appeared. I accessed the atmospheric sensors for the demonstration hall. During the 3 weeks the human attended lectures, the air around him showed traces of at least 14 different compounds that are completely unknown to galactic science. He was not just observing us, Professor. He was conducting molecular-level analysis of every being in proximity. Zethkari felt his legs become unsteady. He lowered himself into his favorite meditation position, though meditation seemed impossible under the circumstances. "There is more," Kothis continued, her chiming voice becoming softer. "The quantum resonance patterns in the hall yesterday afternoon showed dimensional fluctuations that suggest the human was not entirely present in our 3-dimensional space during the demonstration. Somehow, he was simultaneously existing in at least 7 different dimensional frameworks." "That's impossible," the professor whispered. "No known species possesses such capabilities." "Yes," Kothis agreed. "No known species." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If humanity possessed technology that operated across multiple dimensions simultaneously, then their apparent primitiveness wasn't just camouflage, it was a level of technological sophistication so advanced that it could perfectly mimic any desired level of development. Zethkari's office door chimed again. This time, when it opened, the human stepped inside. He looked exactly as he had every day for the past 3 weeks. Unremarkable clothes, simple demeanor, that same brown hair and brown eyes that had seemed so primitive just yesterday. But now, knowing what he knew, Professor Zethkari found himself looking at what might be the most dangerous being he had ever encountered. "Good morning, Professor," the human said politely. Kothes. He nodded to the Zothmari student. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to speak with you before the council meeting. Let's the sumling, ovation. I hope you don't mind, Kothes chimed something that sounded like surprise. You knew about the council meeting? We've been monitoring all communications since my arrival, the human replied matter-of-factly. Not just at the academy. All communications within approximately 50 light-years of this system. It seemed like a reasonable precaution, the casual admission that humanity was apparently monitoring half the local galactic communications network sent both academics into shocked silence. Professor Zethkari, the human continued, I believe you have some questions for me. The professor tried to organize his thoughts, but they scattered like startled insects every time he attempted to focus. Yes. Many questions. But first, I must ask, what happens now? That depends entirely on you, the human said, settling into a chair that suddenly seemed far too small to contain whatever this being actually was. The Academy Council will want to know if this incident represents a pattern of behavior or an isolated error in judgment. The Integration Committee will want to know if your civilization is prepared for honest contact with humanity. And I will want to know if you have learned anything from this experience. Professor Zethkari's 6 arms moved nervously. What would constitute learning? From your perspective, understanding that intelligence cannot be measured by familiar standards, recognizing that different does not mean inferior, accepting that true wisdom includes knowing when you don't know something. Kothes chimed a soft question. May I ask what humanity's true capabilities actually are? The human smiled, and once again that simple expression completely transformed his appearance. That's the right question. Kothes. Thank you for asking it properly. He gestured, and the air around them began to shimmer. The office walls became transparent, revealing not the academy courtyard outside, but what appeared to be the interior of a massive spacecraft that definitely had not been there moments before. This is one of our standard observation vessels, the human explained. It has been maintaining a position approximately 3 inches outside your office wall for the past week, observing your behavior patterns and psychological responses to stress. Professor Zethkari felt his world tilting. 3 inches from my wall? But that's impossible. I would have detected. Would you? Your sensors are designed to detect matter and energy operating within the dimensional framework you understand. We exist in several frameworks simultaneously. From your perspective, we're not really here. From our perspective, you're only partially real. The implications were staggering. If humanity operated in multiple dimensional frameworks, then every assumption about physics, space travel, and detection technology was wrong. How long have you been watching us? Kothes asked. Your species specifically, Kothes. About 40 years. Your civilization as a whole? Approximately 2 centuries. We've been waiting for you to mature enough for contact. Waiting for us to mature? Professor Zethkari's voice cracked slightly. But you sought us out. You made contact. No, Professor. You sought us out. We simply allowed ourselves to be found when we determined you were ready. Or at least, when we hoped you might be ready. The human stood and walked toward the transparent walls, looking out at the impossible spacecraft beyond. The test was never about human intelligence, Professor. It was about galactic wisdom. We needed to know if your civilization could look past appearances, treat unknowns with respect, and maintain ethical standards, even when dealing with those you perceive as inferior. And? Professor Zethkari asked, though he dreaded the answer. Mixed results, the human said diplomatically. Some individuals, like Kothes here, demonstrated genuine curiosity, intellectual humility, and ethical consistency. Others, he gestured toward the professor, others demonstrated that advancement in some areas does not guarantee advancement in others. The professor realized that his entire academic career, his reputation, and quite possibly the future of galactic civilization might depend on the next few minutes. What can I do? How can I correct this? That's the first intelligent question you've asked since I arrived. the human observed. The fact that you asked it suggests there may be hope. He returned to his chair, and the walls of the office returned to their normal opacity. The Academy Council will want a full explanation of what occurred and why. You can choose to blame external factors, defend your methods, and minimize your errors. Or, you can choose to accept responsibility, acknowledge your assumptions, and demonstrate that you've learned something valuable. Professor Zethkari's skin color cycled through several shades before settling on a deep blue that indicated profound contemplation. If I admit to the errors publicly, my career will be finished. Possibly. But if you don't admit to them, your civilization's future relationship with humanity will be finished. Which matters more to you? End quote. The question struck at the heart of everything the professor thought he believed about academic integrity, personal responsibility, and the greater good. Kothas chimed softly. Professor, may I share something I learned from yesterday's demonstration? Zethkari nodded. I realized that I had made the same errors you had, just more quietly. I also assumed human limitations based on appearances. I also felt superior because of technological advantages. The difference was that I did not have the courage to voice these assumptions publicly. So I did not have to face their consequences. The young Zothmari's honest admission seemed to affect the human, whose expression softened slightly. Kothas demonstrates wisdom beyond her years, he said. Recognition of error is the beginning of learning. The question is whether the Academy community can demonstrate similar wisdom. Professor Zethkari found himself at a crossroads that extended far beyond personal consequences. If I publicly acknowledge my errors, what assurance do I have that humanity will continue integration with our civilization? None, the human said bluntly. But if you don't acknowledge them, I can assure you that integration will not continue. That sounds like a threat. It's a consequence. There's a difference. Humanity will not join a civilization that treats perceived inferiors with contempt. We will not allow ourselves to be subjected to condescension and humiliation. We will not pretend that intellectual bullying is acceptable academic behavior. The professor felt the weight of civilizations resting on his shoulders. But surely you understand that academic evaluation requires respect for the subject being evaluated, the human interrupted. It requires intellectual humility from the evaluator. It requires recognizing that failure to understand something might indicate limitations in the evaluator rather than the subject. He leaned forward in his chair. Professor, 3 weeks ago you could have approached me as a colleague. You could have said, "We would like to understand your species better. Would you be willing to help us learn?" Instead, you chose to treat me as a specimen for public examination. That choice revealed something important about your character. I was following established protocols for primitive species integration. Were you? Or were you following your own inclinations toward intellectual dominance? Because Kothas was in the same situation, with the same protocols, and she chose kindness over superiority. The distinction hit home like a physical blow. Professor Zethkari realized that he could not blame institutional procedures for personal choices. What would you have me do? He asked quietly. Be honest. Tell the Academy Council exactly what happened and why. Accept responsibility for your choices. Demonstrate that you understand what went wrong. Show that you can learn from mistakes. And then we'll see if your civilization is ready for honest contact with species who may be different from what they appear. Professor Zethkari looked at Kothas, whose crystalline structure was humming with supportive harmonics. He thought about his long career, his academic reputation, and his position in galactic society. Then he thought about the larger consequences of his choices. If I do this, he said slowly, if I publicly acknowledge these errors, will humanity consider giving our civilization another chance? The human studied him for a long moment. Professor Zethkari, the fact that you're asking that question suggests you're beginning to understand what went wrong. Yes, if you can demonstrate genuine learning, humanity will consider continued integration. But there will be conditions. There will be standards. Academic institutions that engage with humanity will be expected to treat all species with dignity, and respect. Evaluation protocols will be redesigned to emphasize understanding rather than dominance. And individuals who demonstrate ethical consistency will be prioritized for contact. Like Kothes. Like Kothes. The young Zothmari chimed with pleased surprise. You would consider working with me? Kothes. You will be one of our primary contacts going forward. If you're interested. Your questions came from genuine curiosity, rather than desire to prove superiority. That's the foundation of real scientific inquiry. Professor Zethkari felt a mixture of jealousy, admiration, and regret. A student who had shown basic kindness and intellectual humility was being offered opportunities that his centuries of academic achievement could not earn. I will do it, he said finally. I will tell the council exactly what happened. I will accept full responsibility, and I will work to ensure that such errors are not repeated. The human nodded approvingly. That took courage, Professor. Real courage. Will it be enough? For humanity? Possibly. For your own development as a being capable of wisdom? Definitely. Professor Zethkari stood, feeling strangely lighter despite the weight of what he was about to do. May I ask one final question? And, of course, was any of this real? The pencil, the notebook, the 3 weeks of silent observation? Or was it all part of some elaborate test? The human smiled that transforming smile one more time. Professor, everything was real. The pencil really does represent perfect engineering for its purpose. The notebook really did record everything that happened. And I really did spend 3 weeks learning about your civilization by observing how you treated someone you believed to be helpless. But you were never helpless. No, but you didn't know that. You made choices based on what you believed about power dynamics and intellectual hierarchy. Those choices revealed your true character. And now you have the opportunity to demonstrate that character can change, that wisdom can be learned, that even those who make serious errors can grow beyond them. As Professor Zethkari prepared to face the Academy Council, he realized that perhaps the most important lesson of his long career was just beginning.